Now, the trauma-based addict is different than someone who's experienced psychological trauma in this way. So let me share two stories with you, and then I'll share with you this. So, and these are all true stories. I have thousands of them. I had a client who, when he was about 12 or 13 years old, he um, was walking across like a high school football stadium, and this couple, teenage couple, were having sex behind the bleachers. And then this guy who was uncircumcised called him over and demanded that he perform orally on him. And the victim of that crime attached to that event, and he went on to a completely lifestyle that sought out uncircumcised men. Okay, now. And I can tell you several stories like that where, if the perpetrator was older. So here's another situation. Early in my career, I was working with psychiatrists, and I created a sexual assessment for psychiatric hospitals. And I would go in and I would do my sexual assessment because oftentimes we weren't addressing those issues. And those were the issues that were keeping people drunk. I'll never forget, I'll call him Bob. I worked in the Psychiatric Institute for about 2.5, 3 years. And so Bob was there in the beginning, and he would stay in the hospital for about 90 days, and then he'd go for about 50 or 60 days, and he'd come back for 90 days. And this is about the fourth time. So this is almost a year and a half later. So I kind of grew in my career from tech to, doing assessments. And I'm like, Bob, I've spent more time with you than probably your wife in the last year because, you're here 24/7. And I just had this intuition, always hear your own intuition when you're talking to people. And I asked Bob, I said, Bob, were you ever sexually abused? And he said, yes, I was held at knife point and gunpoint by two men at two different times. I said, well, have you ever dealt with that in all this time of being here and counseling? He said, no. And that was part of his situation that was keeping him drunk. He said to me, when I asked him, have you ever dealt with it? He said, not sober. So when he would drink, he would reminisce about this, and that kept him in his alcoholism, and he got better after talking about that and walking through that process. But the other story I want to share with you, so I was doing this psychiatric assessments, and I'm not ADHD. I always go back to where I started. And so I was sitting in a room that was probably the size of a small closet in an apartment, really. It was a regular general hospital, a psychiatric unit, one floor. They gave me a little space. The psychiatrist wanted me to do an assessment on him. And I said, okay. So I'm like, not sure why I'm here. The guy was suicidal. He was overweight. He had his beard. He was a mess, and he looked like he was depressed, like just really bad. And so I go in this little space with him. I say, hey, I need to ask you some questions. Your doctor recommended this. So I go through kind of the assessment that we're going to cover here. And I always ask about the first sexual encounter. I don't ask if you've been sexually abused. I ask, what was your first sexual encounter? How old were you? Okay, how old was the other person? Well, for him, he was roughly around 14 years old, and his friend, Joey, was down the street, and they played together a lot. And so he went down there, and Joey wasn't there, and the dad wasn't there, but the mom was there, and she performed the pin orally, and then he went back the next day. They started having intercourse, and they had that several times a week up until the day he was married at 33 years old. So for 20 years, he was being sexually abused by this woman, right? And so I said, okay, so tell me why you're in the hospital. Why do you want to commit suicide? He said, well, I'm having an affair with 9 women right now, and I can't keep track of it. It's driving me crazy. And I said, okay. I said, well, what are the ages of these women? And all of them were 15 to 25 years older than him. He wasn't going for the stripper. He wasn't going for the young, sexual body. He wasn't going for a bodybuilder. He was going for someone who fit exactly his sexual abuse. And so, Dr. Vanderkolk does the best work on this. One of my favorite articles is the compulsion to repeat the trauma. And this is where the sex addict, the sexual abuse, or the trauma-based sex addict will go into a situation and parallel their sexual abuse. Now, they can parallel it in one of two ways: as the victim or as the perpetrator.